Grateful to our speakers this morning who will each offer their own perspective on a personal experience or the work that they do in terms of immigration. And I know, and I'm also very grateful to the committee that worked hard for months really to put this Sunday together and to gather us in this way and to help focus our attention and intention on the need of the immigrant. And so we ground ourselves in this word from God, which is a portion of the parable of the Samaritan. It's just a piece of it. So I invite you to open your hearts and your ears and your minds and see how these words speak to you in this day and time. An expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live."
Hi, my name is Nora Montañez Patterson, and I am a theater creator here in Minnesota. I am a playwright, I'm a performer, I am a singer, a musician, I am an educator. I teach at St. Paul Conservatory for the Performing Artist as a faculty, staff, and I am also an arts advocate. I was born in Lima, Peru, to two enthusiastic musicians. My mother was a singer and a dancer, and my father was a musician, and he dabbled in dance as well. So I was raised in the arts. I was raised in dance halls and restaurants and dressing rooms. That was my playground. We immigrated to New York, Queens, New York, and when I was at the age of 3. And I remember asking my parents at a later age, asking them to tell me their story, their immigration story. And they both told me that it was very challenging. They lost a lot. They lost community in my country. They lost relationships, and they lost family members. They lost history. And however, we were very lucky because we arrived here to some family who had arrived earlier. And, but also very challenging as well, because I feel like the American mentality is you get here and you just do what you need to do in order to succeed. And so very little is handed down. And so that was very challenging for my parents. So my father worked constantly and we rarely saw him. And my mother stayed at home and raised us. And you could tell that a lot of the weight and stress to assimilating to this new country was taking a toll on her mental health. I was lucky because my parents raised me with all of the beautiful culture, all of our music, our food, even though there were things that I still wanted, or I still was needing me to assimilate to this country. We still held on to our language. We still held on to our culture. And so I was really, really blessed in that regard. So much so that I was a very expressive child. I was different. I was told, because I was the oldest of four on my mother's side, that I was very enthusiastic and very leading my mom's path, which is all about music, all about just being invested in art. And my father, actually, my father continues to perform now. And so that led me to have the love of the arts. And my parents continued dancing and performing in my country for a very, very long time, until they eventually separated, and we moved to New Jersey, and that's where I was raised. Being an immigrant for me is a part of my identity that I hold very, very dear. As a creative artist, I move forward with that thought of, as a playwright, I write plays based on the ever expansiveness of what Latinidad means. We're not a monolithic culture. Our countries come from very different socioeconomic statuses, skin color, language and music and food. And so for me, my indigenous Peruvian lifestyle has really informed me who I am. A lot of the plays that I write are surrounding the Latinidad culture and all of the characters that I also portray on stage. So all of that included what my parents raised me to be has really informed me of who I am. I don't shy away from saying that I'm an immigrant. I embrace it. I love it. That is me. And I know that there are communities that really are afraid. And I have the benefit, I have the privilege of saying, I know 2 languages. I am documented in this country. I am educated. I live in a neighborhood where societally, culturally, and economically, I am safe. And so that's something that as an advocate, I move forward with. And it is a great pleasure to share my story with you all. And I know that that was just a little snippet of who I am, but know that a part of being in Plymouth is also sharing and being true to who I am. And that is what I show every Sunday coming in. So thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing everyone else's stories.
Good morning. My name is Sara Adams, and I'm the coordinator of the AID program at Interfaith Coalition on Immigration. AID is a program which provides emotional support and material resources to asylum seekers, undocumented immigrants, and detainees. The activism we practice is pragmatic. AID volunteers are like frontline workers who respond to the basic needs of some of the most vulnerable members of society. You might wonder, why are immigrants so vulnerable? And the answer is because they have no safety net. If you are not a part of an immigrant community, you might not know a lot about how hard it is to be here. There is a lot of poverty, a lot of uncertainty about the future, and a lot of fear. People don't come to this country because it's easy. They come because conditions in their homeland are untenable. You have to be desperate to make that journey. In aid right now, we have a family who recently fled Venezuela. They knew no one in Minnesota, so their plan was to live at the airport. They had nowhere else to go. A Good Samaritan found them, and aid has been able to help them find shelter, clothing for a Minnesota winter, and food. I often get the question, can't immigrants apply for assistance? And the answer is basically no. I became interested in immigrant justice because I used to work in social services. I worked for a home visiting program in which 85% of our participants were foreign-born. The contract we had with families was to provide services to a family for 2 full years. So I visited each family twice a week for 2 years. There's no space more intimate than a person's home. And so I became very familiar to people and was trusted with the stories. The 2 common themes were fleeing violence and escaping poverty. As a visitor, most immigrants I met were extremely gracious. They would send me home with food, make me handmade gifts, invite me to their baptisms and weddings. They're really hard workers. Adults often work 2 to 3 jobs to make ends meet. They're very loving parents, interested in the success of their children. Despite hardship, their faith carries them, and conversations often begin and end with "si Dios quiera," which is Spanish for "if God wills it," or "inshallah," which is Arabic for "if Allah wills it." As a home visitor, I was often the only native-born Minnesotan they knew, and like their communities, they welcomed me into their homes. The first thing that impressed me was how extensive immigrant communities actually are. I would drive around the metro area looking for the addresses of my clients. Driving, I saw the familiar sound barriers that line the highway corridors. Later, I began to see behind the walls. You may have seen those walls. Behind them are endless apartment complexes that line the frontage roads. They line every highway in the metro area, from White Bear Lake to Chanhassen. Those buildings were where my clients lived, and whole complexes are filled with people from Mexico, or people from Liberia, or people from Somalia. There's a building here behind Plymouth Church that's filled solely with residents from the Gambia, Africa. I spent a lot of time in that building. Poverty was pervasive. Even in buildings that look tidy on the outside, it's common for 6 or 10 or 14 people to live in 2-bedroom apartments. They sleep in shifts because there are not 14 beds. This is what families can afford. Landlords often don't make repairs. I remember an occasion when the ceiling was literally falling down in chunks. One chunk fell on a home visitor. The landlord made it clear that complaining meant eviction, and the family didn't want to pursue their rights. They were too afraid. But this poverty is also relative. One client told me, in America, there is no poverty. I don't agree, but there are degrees of desperation. One woman spoke of famine. The rain stopped falling and the crops wouldn't grow. So to survive, villages emptied except for the elderly, grandparents who were left behind to care for small children, the small children that their mothers left behind. Leaving behind your child is an impossible choice, but it is an act of love. Parents send money home for offspring they might not ever see again. We hear about unaccompanied minors arriving here, and some of these are the children of our neighbors. One client drove to Arizona to meet her 12-year-old son, who had just crossed the border. He came alone by land from Ecuador. I have a friend who has been here for 20 years. He shows me pictures of his daughter on his phone. He lives with several other men, and that's a way to save money. He hasn't seen his daughter for 20 years, but he's put her through university so she could have a better life than he has had. He has cancer now, but he doesn't have health insurance. He doesn't qualify. This is the daily life of many immigrants. The rules for public assistance are complicated. You have to be more than poor. You have to inhabit a category. If you're born here, you qualify. If you have a green card, you qualify. If you have been granted asylum, you qualify. If you're here lawfully seeking asylum, you generally don't qualify. And if you're undocumented, you definitely don't qualify. Without safety nets, crises are like dominoes. For me, the greatest irony working in social services was that most of the clients I'd been hired to help couldn't access most of the resources my agency had to offer. So I, as a person, began to feel very cynical. And then, in about 2016, I discovered faith communities. I began to solicit funds from an area church, and I ran around giving out packets of cash to help people pay their rent. I felt rebellious, like I was circumventing the system, and actually, I think I was. For me, it was an aha moment, because faith communities can respond in ways that social services can't. They're not just places of worship. They're not just doctrines and creeds. They can be manifestations of action and radical kindness. So the role of your faith community in immigrant justice work is really, really important. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Reed, a member of the Plymouth Immigrant Welcoming Working Group. And as you can see this morning, we at Plymouth Church work hard to welcome the stranger in many ways into our congregation, our community, into our country. So it was with this faith teaching in mind that a group of about 20 of us journeyed to the Arizona-Mexico border in February 2020 to welcome the stranger, welcome the immigrants into our country. Well, what happens when you're prevented from welcoming the stranger? You see, just a couple weeks before our departure, the previous administration implemented the very, very strict policy of remain in Mexico. So there were virtually no immigrants entering the United States. Well, we were undeterred, and with the assistance of Reverend Del McCormick and Beth Faith and our committee, we revised our plan. It became one of immersion, a pilgrimage in a sort of way. And our revised goal was to listen to migrant stories where they were in Mexico, learn about the challenges facing them, and also about our very convoluted and complex immigration system, and lamenting, feeling the deep pain, the deep grief for people having to leave their homes behind on short notice, fleeing to an unknown future. So we ended up not welcoming the stranger to our country so much as we became the strangers in a way, because we went to various shelters where migrants shared their hospitality and their stories with us and enabled us to incorporate their stories into our own life stories. One was a dining room of a women's co-op in which the women who had fled the notorious Sinaloa province earlier were beginning a new life for themselves and their children. They were growing their own produce. They served us a delicious home-cooked meal with warm hospitality. They allowed us to purchase some of the items they were creating through their sewing cooperative. And we saw evidence of the success of their new and safer life when their children came home from school. And the children filed in their immaculate pressed school uniforms, went dutifully over to kiss their mothers, greeted us very politely, ate their lunch, and went to do their homework. Now, there are parents and grandparents in the congregation this morning who would appreciate what an impressive sight that was. Another example, we met a family of migrants where they were, which was unsheltered, frankly, on a sidewalk just a few meters from the point of entry into the United States. They were huddled under a black tarp, just a stretch of tarp from the sidewalk to a fence. Totally dark, of course, and inhospitable. But they were waiting there for their opportunity to plead their case as asylum seekers, and they did not want to miss out on that opportunity. So they were huddled under there and gave us the gift of their trust. The father emerged first, told us their story. Then two little boys came out very shyly, rubbed their eyes against the very bright Mexican sun, and clung to their father's pant legs. Finally, their mother stepped out of the tarp, a very, very pregnant indigenous mother who spoke no Spanish and certainly no English. Well, as you can see, we experienced a lot of very emotional moments on our journey. We had listened, learned, lamented, and then it was time to come home and find new ways to lead, new ways of taking action to improve the condition of immigrants all over our country, or seeking to enter our country. So this has happened in many ways. Some of us are tireless advocates for social justice for immigrants through organizations, as Sara described, and others. Some of us take action in smaller ways. We buy and drink Just Coffee. Maybe you ordered some this morning. Well, Just Coffee is a project that Plymouth has embraced in which we buy coffee directly from farmers in Chiapas, grow the coffee there, roast it there, ship it directly to us with nobody in the middle. So that's enabled the villages there in Chiapas to retain their citizens looking for a brighter future, earning a decent wage. And finally, we speak up. When we hear disparaging comments about immigrants, resident aliens, asylum seekers, and so forth, we remember the conversation we had with a migrant father in a shelter in Mexico as he held his young daughter in his arms, surrounded by other folks sharing this house with one family in each bedroom. We asked, how can we help? Because it felt pretty hopeless and discouraging at that moment in our trip. And the gentleman looked at us, didn't hesitate a moment, and said, "Tell the American people que no somos criminales." We are not criminals. No somos criminales. So that image will be in our minds as some of us and others, I hope, from the Plymouth community join together in raising our voices at a vigil in early November. Plymouth is hosting the vigil. There will be an hour of songs, of poetry, of meaningful words, and perhaps a little bit of Just Coffee. So I'll close with a happy moment, my favorite memory. Remember a couple minutes ago I mentioned a family huddled under the black tarp? Well, unbelievably, we saw them again in Tucson, in the United States, having successfully pled their case as asylum seekers. So we entered a beautifully restored shelter in Tucson. Of course, there were very few immigrants there, just this family of four and a couple others. The children running around, everyone eating and getting clothing and transportation assistance to go to their sponsors. And they were receiving excellent medical care. Well, that was very important, of course, for the very pregnant mother of a family. But you know, I became very, very certain that they were getting excellent medical care because the volunteer provider was my own retired doctor from here in the Twin Cities. Now, Dr. Erdman found ways of helping the immigrants, helping the stranger, befriending the stranger. And not all of us can go to Arizona or other border communities, but we can all find ways in our daily lives to seek out small ways, big ways, to welcome the stranger into our lives. May it be so.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank all the musicians, the planners, Judy Tokanen, who co-chaired the committee and organized all of our meetings and led them and did an amazing job. Thank you. Nancy Siska, who chairs the Immigrant Welcoming Working Group. And I meant to ask you, can anybody still sign up for the trip? 2 people. So if you want to go on the trip like Barb did, she has 2 more spaces. Keep that in mind. So thank you all, and to the staff, of course, for all the work they've done. We've heard these powerful stories from Nora, who was an immigrant, from Sara, who is spending her life working to make the world a better place for the immigrants who are here in the Twin Cities. Thank you. And Barbara, for sharing your story about going down to the border. All this is very important. And my job is to talk theology. Surprised? Where is God in all of this? What kind of God lets all of these things happen? Why can't God fix it? I have a few minutes to answer those questions. I define God more as the power and spirit of love, pure love. Love for all of this creation, every person, every living thing. The spirit of love that doesn't and never has needed a sacrifice or to test or to punish us. We never need to ask for mercy because it's in abusive relationships where we ask for mercy. And this all-loving spirit can't abuse us. Not ever. So if this power is all about love, why is the world such a mess? And why do hurtful things happen? One answer is greed, which has incredible power in our world and always has. A man once told me, greed is good. It's what made America great. I disagree. Greed led to slavery, unsafe workplaces, low wages, lower wages for women and people of color. You all know the history. And greed is why people need to escape their country because of wars, famines, no jobs, climate issues, gangs, unsafe living conditions, and more. Another issue is that too many people believe God is in control and that even that hurtful and bad things are God's doings. I can't be in relationship with that kind of God. Process theology. I learned my first semester at seminary, and it makes all the sense in the world to me. It says that in every millisecond, God, this power of love, knows what everyone's choice throughout the whole world should be for there to be true peace and harmony throughout the whole world. Imagine that world. All people are accepted for who they are. Differences are celebrated. Everyone has enough income so all needs are met. There are no wars. Peace everywhere. And there's no reason for anybody to migrate, to immigrate. All is great. So why hasn't God made this happen? According to process theology, because God is limited. Limited by us. Besides this God of love influencing us for true peace and harmony, we are influenced by everything that's ever happened to us. Everyone we've met, all the world's events, all the history, all the movies we've seen. Every experience we've ever had is part of our past. So everyone, in every millisecond, is influenced by their past and by this incredible spirit of love. I never ask God to be near. God is always near. Rather, I ask for openness to God, openness to this incredible love, because God needs me. God needs you. God needs us to make the difference that can bring about peace and harmony. And don't worry, no one gets it right all the time. Even Jesus didn't. But Jesus showed us how we're to live, seeking justice, caring for the most vulnerable, valuing everyone on this earth. And God needs us to be open to the power of God's love. God needs us to be willing to take risks and truly care for God's creation. God needs us to be open to God's influence in our everyday lives. I once smiled at a woman walking nearby with a hijab, and she looked shocked that I smiled at her, but she smiled back. I don't know if she remembers that, but I remember it, so now it's part of my past, influencing me as I move into the future. God needs our love. God needs us to love our neighbors, and our neighbors are everyone throughout the whole world, even Putin. What can we as individuals and a community of faith do to make this a better world for immigrants? Learn more by reading, listening to thoughtful news programs, and the reading. John Humphrey has put books out in Jones Commons that you can read. Listening to programs that are about this issue, attending study groups and forums like the one we had today. Thank you very much, Dell. By attending vigils, there's this one coming up in November out at the Whipple Building. By contacting your politicians and complaining about what they're doing with the DACA youth, people who have lived there virtually their whole life, some of whom I know have been sent back to their country where they've never lived as an adult and don't even speak the language. Have conversations with family, friends, coworkers, including those who disagree with you, speaking up for the most vulnerable and work for justice. Do these things with an openness to God. You'll be surprised at what you're able to do. And in the process, you are putting good stuff in your past and in the past of others that God can use to make this a better world for all people. Be open to the incredible power of this love as much as you can. It is life-changing for so many. Amen.